This video is about
American history.
This video is meant to describe the situation in the United States in the time period just before the outbreak of the Civil War. The Civil War is perhaps the seminal event in American history. The great Democratic-Republican experiment that was the United States of America was put to a very bloody test. As you may remember, the sectional divisions within the United States can trace their roots all the way back to the original settlers in the northern and southern regions of the Atlantic coast. 250 years later, those two differences can no longer coexist. The decades leading up to 1860 had witnessed political compromises that attempted to allow the sectional differences to exist without dissolving the Union. Only a couple of years after the passing of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, it became clear to many that political compromise would no longer work. In the Senate chamber in Washington, D.C. on May 22, 1856, Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner was addressing copies of a speech he had made days before. It was a withering attack of individual senators who had supported the popular sovereignty provisions of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. In his speech, entitled Crime Against Kansas, Senator Sumner had included some sexually suggestive language that was directed at Andrew Butler, a senator from South Carolina. As Senator Sumner sat at his desk, Preston Brooks, a South Carolinian member of the House of Representatives and Andrew Butler's nephew, entered the Senate chamber to give Charles Sumner a piece of his mind. He walked over to Senator Sumner and started hitting him with his walking cane, as depicted here in a famous political cartoon. The force of the blows that rained down on Sumner was so great that the walking cane, which is on display at the State House in Boston, split. Sumner, trapped in his seat, tried so hard to get up and evade the blows that he ripped his desk loose from the bolts holding it to the floor. Eventually, Brooks was pulled away by two men, and Sumner lay unconscious on the floor of the Senate chamber. If this was the way that elected officials were behaving, you can imagine that there wasn't much hope left for preserving the Union. The Civil War holds a very special place in the American consciousness. The country was split, communities were split, and families were split. Sometimes the war is presented romantically as the end of an era of cooperation and, especially in the South, of chivalry, respectful gentlemen and ladies living well and treating each other well. Acts of individual and group bravery were celebrated or are celebrated, and some of the famous generals are remembered as honorable men who fought because they saw it as their duty to do so. The reality is that the war was, like any other, brutal. 4 years of struggle left over 1 million people dead or wounded and cities reduced to rubble. The Civil War goes by different names, depending on who is talking about it. In the South, in particular, there are a variety of names used. I would like to highlight two today. The war between the states is an interesting one because implicit in the name is that the South was an independent state in the legal sense of the word, and no longer part of the Union. If one accepts this as true, then the Union had no legal right to force the Confederate States of America to join the United States of America. Mr. Lincoln's War is another interesting one because it does not hide on whom people think the blame should rest for the war. Again, the name implies that everything was fine, which is debatable, before Mr. Lincoln started his war. I would also like to draw your attention to the late unpleasantness. I heard that term, or I've also heard the recent unpleasantness, as late as 2013. These names should indicate to you the emotional connection that Americans still have to the Civil War. The spark that caused the war is generally believed to be the results of the presidential election of 1860. The election was between four candidates: John Bell of the Constitutional Union Party, Abraham Lincoln of the Republican Party, Stephen Douglas of the Northern Wing of the Democratic Party, and John Breckinridge of the Southern Wing of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party had split across sectional lines, and so each wing ran its own candidate in its own region. The election was, in effect, two different races. In the North, the contest was between Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln. In the South, it was between Breckinridge and Bell. The Republican Party's platform was to not interfere with slavery where it already existed, but to prevent its expansion, to open up the West to homesteading, and to promote further industrialization, including manufacturing and a transcontinental railroad. As you know, Lincoln and the Republicans go on to win this election. As you can see from this map, the results reflect the sectional discord that existed at the time. Lincoln dominated the free states in the Northeast and the Northwest, and in the Far West. There were enough electoral votes in these states for Lincoln to win the presidency. A surprising result is that Stephen Douglas finished second in the popular vote here, but still finished last in the electoral vote. In a relatively short period of time, Douglas had gone from top presidential candidate to earning just 12 of a possible 303 electoral votes. Shortly after Lincoln's election, and before his inauguration in March of 1861, 7 southern states seceded from the Union to form the Confederate States of America. Along the coast of South Carolina was a U.S. Army sea fort, Fort Sumter. Confederate artillery started firing on Fort Sumter at 4:30 in the morning on April 12, 1861. This bombardment is popularly known as the opening shots of the Civil War. After 34 hours of shelling, the fort's commanding officer, Major Anderson, surrendered the fort. He and his men were given safe passage north to rejoin the U.S. Army. Within 5 weeks, another 4 states will secede and join the Confederate States of America, and so the battle lines were drawn. The Confederate States of America were composed of 11 states. The Union had 23, including 4 states that did not secede: Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. Before closing, let's spend a few minutes comparing the combatants. You may wish to pause the video to investigate these statistics further, or you may want to come back to them later on, because I'm just going to go through them briefly here. The first stat is the overwhelming numerical superiority of the Union. They outnumbered the Confederate States in terms of men, manufacturing, and firearm production. All of these factors combined suggested to the Confederate military leadership that a defensive war, and hopefully a quick one, was the best strategy for success. The North was also better equipped to move men and supplies farther and more efficiently than the South. New England and the Northwest were crisscrossed by railroad tracks. Many of them were a standard gauge, which is the distance between the rails. You can see from this map that railroad building exploded in the Midwest in the 1850s, with the network of rail lines joining up with lines to New England and the Atlantic seaboard. In the South, there were far fewer miles of track built by 1860. There were 2 major logistical issues that the Confederate Army would face when it came to using the railroad infrastructure to move men and material. The first is that there was only one major east-west line. It connected Norfolk, Virginia to Memphis, Tennessee. Having just a single line meant that rail traffic was limited to one direction at a time. Here, in the heart of the line, only one train could run. This would really hamper the Confederate war effort. In the North, by comparison, you could have trains running west on one line and other trains running east on another. What's more, the gauges in the South were different. Most of the tracks in the Deep South were the same, but the gauges in North Carolina and Virginia were different. This meant that trains could not travel non-stop through the South. When a gauge changed, the train had to stop. It couldn't go any further. All of the men and material had to be unloaded and then loaded onto a train that fit the other track. This could add hours or days to the transportation of troops, and that could be the deciding factor in a battle. The final comparison I would like to bring to your attention is that the Confederate States of America were better prepared for war socially and emotionally. And by that I mean that military tradition ran deep in the South. Some of you may remember that in the aftermath of Bacon's Rebellion all the way back in 1676, a political decision was made to arm white colonists as a means of defending the colony against attack by Native Americans. These white colonists formed militia units that forged a common bond between colonists. Almost 200 years later, the descendants of those colonists were members of military units too. The idea of a career in the military was seen as an honorable career, and that led to the romanticism I spoke about at the beginning. All things military are not as ingrained in the cultures of the Northeast and the Midwest. While there are students who attend the military college at West Point, New York, they often return to civilian life soon afterward. So, despite its statistical disadvantages, the South has an emotional or psychological edge in this war. We will see in the next video just how quote-unquote disconnected the military is from Northern society. The Confederate States of America chose Richmond, Virginia as their capital. This was an interesting choice because it was only 175 kilometers away from Washington, D.C. It is less than the distance between Toronto and Belleville, Ontario. Given that the two nations are so close physically and tied together by familial relationships, it should not come as a surprise that people living on both sides of the war were unsure which side to support. These statistics show the divided loyalties that existed among military men either from the South or who had relatives there. You will notice that in the first two cases, the majority of these men decided to fight in the Confederate Army, despite being, at the time of Southern secession, soldiers or officers in the United States Army. The final statistic is very interesting because it indicates that support for the Union was stronger among Southerners who had served in the United States Army for a longer period of time. Almost half of the 27 Virginians who'd graduated from West Point between 1802 and 1830 served in the Union Army when the Civil War broke out. One very notable exception was Colonel Robert E. Lee. He had led the U.S. Marines against John Brown at Harper's Ferry in 1859. After the attack on Fort Sumter, President Lincoln offered Lee command of the Union Army, but he refused. 5 days later, he resigned his commission in the U.S. Army, saying that his loyalty was to his home state of Virginia. I will stop there on the precipice of the fighting. Please stay tuned for my next video, which will provide an overview of the fighting of the Civil War. See you next time. Thank you very much for watching this video about
American history.